Rex Turnbull's voice cut across the VFW hall like a blade through cardboard. You need to leave. Now, we have actual veterans here tonight. Not whatever you are. The old man at the corner table didn't look up. His weathered hands remained still on the worn tablecloth, one finger tracing a slow circle on the fabric. What Turnbull didn't know, what no one in that hall knew yet, was why that particular table had been empty for 53 years. And in exactly 40 minutes, the newly elected post commander would be on his knees, tears streaming down his face, begging forgiveness from a man whose call sign was still whispered with reverence in every Special Forces unit from Fort Bragg to Okinawa. The VFW hall had been decorated with the careful patriotism of people who meant every flag they hung. Red, white, and blue bunting draped the stage where the memorial ceremony would take place. Folding chairs had been arranged in neat rows facing the podium. A banner stretched across the back wall, reading, "We remember our fallen," in letters that had faded from years of Memorial Days, just like this one. The bar along the east wall was doing steady business, old men in veteran caps trading stories that grew taller with each telling. Local politicians worked the room with practiced smiles, shaking hands, thanking people for their service with words that cost them nothing. And in the corner, partially hidden by a support column, sat a man who looked like he had wandered in from the street. Because he had. His clothes were several sizes too large, donated pieces that hung on his thin frame like curtains on a forgotten window. His flannel shirt was missing 2 buttons. His boots were held together with strips of duct tape wrapped around the soles. His beard was long and gray, not the distinguished gray of a man who had aged well, but the weathered gray of someone who had stopped caring what he looked like a long time ago. But his posture was perfect. Rex Turnbull had noticed him 20 minutes ago and had been working up the courage to confront him ever since. This was his first Memorial Day as post commander, and everything needed to be perfect. The local news was here. The mayor was here. A congressman was supposed to arrive within the hour. And this homeless man, this embarrassment, was sitting at a table in the corner like he belonged here. I said, "You need to leave." Rex's voice carried across the hall, theatrical in its volume, meant to be heard. Several heads turned toward the corner. This is a private event for veterans and their families, not a shelter. The old man's hands remained still on the tablecloth. His eyes, when he finally raised them, were the color of creek water after a heavy rain, gray with depths that were hard to measure. "I understand, sir." His voice was quiet, hoarse from disuse, but there was something underneath it, something solid. "I was hoping to stay for the reading of the names, if that would be acceptable." Rex felt a flicker of uncertainty, quickly smothered by the awareness that people were watching. The reading of the names was the centerpiece of the ceremony, when the names of local veterans who had died in service would be read aloud while the hall stood in silence. It was sacred, and this man wanted to witness it like he had earned the right. "The reading of the names is for people who served," Rex said, his contempt sharpening each word. "For people who sacrificed, not for people who wander in off the street, looking for a handout." The old man nodded slowly, as if he had expected exactly this response. "I'm not looking for a handout, sir. Just to stay until the names are read. Then I will leave." Something about his calm was infuriating. Rex had dealt with homeless veterans before, men who loudly proclaimed their service while asking for money, men who wore surplus store medals and told stories that fell apart under the slightest scrutiny. This man wasn't doing any of that. He wasn't defending himself. He wasn't explaining. He was just sitting there with that impossible stillness, like a stone that had learned to wait. "Do you have any proof you served?" Rex demanded. "A DD-214? Anything at all?" The old man was quiet for a long moment. "I do not carry my papers anymore. Have not for a long time. But I served, right?" Rex let the word drip with sarcasm. Just like every other guy who claims he was Special Forces or a Navy SEAL or whatever Hollywood movie he watched last week. He turned to address the growing crowd of onlookers. "We get them every year, you know. Men who never wore the uniform, trying to soak up respect they never earned. If you're watching this story from anywhere in the world, we would love to know where you're joining us from. Drop a comment below telling us your city or country. Stories like this one about hidden heroes happen in every community, maybe even yours. You might have a quiet legend in your own neighborhood whose humble appearance hides an extraordinary story of sacrifice. Now, let us continue. The old man at the corner table did not respond to Rex's accusation. He simply looked past him toward the memorial wall on the east side of the hall. 3 names were visible from where he sat, engraved on a brass plaque beneath the words, "Our honored dead." Rex followed his gaze, then turned back with renewed suspicion. "Why you keep looking at that wall?" The old man's weathered fingers, scarred and calloused in ways that spoke of decades of hard use, moved to touch something beneath his shirt. Just a brief gesture, almost unconscious, before his hand returned to the tablecloth. "Because I knew them," he said quietly. "The 3 names on the left. I knew them." Rex laughed, a harsh bark meant to humiliate. "Of course you did, and I'm sure you saved them all single-handedly in some secret mission that nobody can verify." He turned to the crowd, playing to his audience. 5 minutes, folks. I am giving him 5 minutes to produce some kind of proof, and then I am calling the police to remove him for trespassing." Several veterans in the crowd shifted uncomfortably. An elderly man in a wheelchair near the bar had stopped mid-conversation, his eyes fixed on the corner table with an expression that was impossible to read. But Rex Turnbull had made a mistake. Not in his accusations, not in his deadline, in choosing that particular table, because that table had been empty for 53 years for a reason, and the reason was about to walk through the door. The 3 names on the memorial wall had not changed in 53 years. Sergeant First Class William Draper, Staff Sergeant Emmanuel Cross, Corporal Isaiah Okonkwo, brass letters on a brass plaque, polished twice a year by volunteers who never knew the men those letters represented. But the old man at the corner table knew them. He had watched them die. Laos, 1971. The wet season had turned the jungle into something that breathed, a living thing that sweated and rotted and swallowed Soundhole. Staff Sergeant Elias Henshaw was 25 years old, leading a 6-man team on an extraction that officially never happened. The CIA had an asset embedded within North Vietnamese supply column, and someone needed to bring him home before his cover collapsed. They had inserted by helicopter at 0300, rappelling into a darkness so complete that Elias could not see his own hands on the rope. The jungle canopy closed above them like a mouth. For 6 hours they moved through terrain that wanted to kill them, navigating by compass and instinct, communicating in hand signals when they communicated at all. Corporal Isaiah Okonkwo was the youngest of them, 19 years old, from the south side of Chicago, on his 2nd mission with the team. He had a habit of writing letters to his mother that he never mailed, folding them into tight squares, and tucking them into his breast pocket. Elias had asked him once why he never sent them. Zeke had smiled, that bright flash of teeth in his dark face, and said that he would give them all to her when he got home. A whole stack of letters, proof that he had thought of her every single day. Elias had made a promise to Zeke's mother before deployment. The woman had traveled all the way to Fort Bragg, had stood outside the gates in a dress she had clearly saved for special occasions, had waited for 6 hours until someone brought her son to her. Elias had walked with Zeke to that meeting, had watched the way the young man's hard-earned military bearing crumbled into the arms of the woman who raised him. And when Zeke went to get her some water, she had grabbed Elias's arm with a grip that surprised him. "Bring him home," she had said. "Whatever happens over there, you bring my boy home." "Yes, ma'am," Elias had answered. "I give you my word." The memory dissolved as Rex Turnbull's voice cut through again, dragging Elias back to the present. "Are you even listening to me?" The post commander had moved closer, emboldened by the lack of resistance. "I said you have 5 minutes. That means 4.5 now. You understand what happens when the police get here?" Elias understood. He had been arrested before, in other towns, for the crime of existing in spaces where his appearance made people uncomfortable. He knew the routine. The handcuffs that were always too tight. The back of the squad car that always smelled like vomit and despair. The holding cell where he would sit until someone decided he was not worth the paperwork and let him go. He did not want that. Not tonight. Not on Memorial Day. "I understand, sir," he said again, and the gentleness in his voice seemed to confuse Rex more than resistance would have. "I would just like to stay for the reading of the names. Then I will go quietly." Rex's face reddened. "The reading of the names. You keep saying that like it means something to you. Like you have any connection to the men on that wall." Elias looked at the three names again. Draper, Cross, Okonkwo. 53 years since they had sat at this very table, laughing and drinking and talking about what they would do when they got home. This corner had been theirs. The table where Shepard's team always gathered between missions. After the ambush, after the funerals, after the classified reports were filed and forgotten, no one else would sit here. It became tradition. The empty table. The seats reserved for men who would never return to fill them. Elias had not known about the tradition until years later, when he finally worked up the courage to visit this VFW for the first time. Eleanor had been with him then, his wife of 30 years, the woman who had held him through nightmares he could never fully explain, who had learned to read his silences the way other wives learn to read words. She had taken his hand when he saw the empty table, when he understood what it meant, when the weight of it nearly drove him to his knees. "They kept it for you," she had whispered. "All these years. They kept it for you and your boys." He had wept then, the first time he had wept for them since the funerals. And Eleanor had held him in the corner of a VFW hall while strangers pretended not to notice. And she had told him that he was allowed to grieve, that surviving was not a betrayal, that his brothers would want him to live. Eleanor, 7 years gone now. Cancer that ate through her like fire through dry paper. Despite every treatment, despite every prayer, despite every desperate bargain Elias tried to make with a God he was not sure he believed in anymore. He had held her hand at the end, in the hospice room that smelled of antiseptic and flowers, and she had looked at him with those eyes that had always seen straight through to his broken places. "Live," she had said, "promise me. Do not follow me yet." He had promised, but he had not known how to keep that promise, not without her. So he had given away the house and the furniture and everything that reminded him of a life that felt impossible to continue. He had walked away from the VA, from the benefits, from the people who try to help. He had reduced himself to what he could carry. Dog tags on a chain, her wedding ring next to them, a worn astronomy book that she had loved, full of pictures of stars she would never see. And the letters, Zeke's letters, still folded into tight squares, still undelivered after 53 years. Rex was still talking, his voice a distant irritation, like a fly buzzing against glass. "I have seen 100 men like you," the post commander was saying. 100 homeless guys claiming they were Rangers or SEALs or whatever else sound impressive. You know what they all have in common? None of them can prove a single thing, because it is all fantasy, all make-believe to explain why their lives fell apart. "My life fell apart," Elias said quietly, "because everyone I loved died, and I did not know how to live without them." Something in his voice made Rex pause. A hairline crack in the post commander's certainty, but it sealed over quickly, papered over with the desperate need to be right. "Convenient story," Rex said, "but stories do not mean anything without proof. And you do not have any proof. So when those 5 minutes are up, you are gone." Elias did not argue. He simply looked back at the wall, at the names, at the brass letters that spelled out the men who had trusted him to bring them home. He had failed 3 of them, but he had carried one of them out. 6 miles through enemy territory, with Zeke's blood soaking through his uniform, with 17 dead enemies left in his wake. He had kept his promise to a mother in a Sunday dress. And now, 53 years later, he just wanted to hear her son's name read aloud one more time. The door to the VFW hall opened. Elias did not turn to look, but something shifted in the room. A murmur passed through the crowd, and somewhere, someone whispered a word that made the old man's heart stutter in his chest. "Okonkwo." Someone had just said the name Okonkwo. The woman who walked through the door moved with the quiet purpose of someone who had spent a lifetime caring for others. She was in her late 60s, her hair silver and natural, her dress simple but carefully chosen. She carried herself with a dignity that seemed unconscious, as natural as breathing. And on the lapel of her jacket, she wore a small gold pin in the shape of a folded flag. Darlene Okonkwo Baptiste had been searching for for 53 years. Not constantly, not obsessively, but with a patience that had outlasted her mother, her first marriage, and her own doubts about whether the search would ever end. She was looking for a man whose name she did not know, whose face she had never seen, whose only identifying feature was a promise he had kept to a woman in a Sunday dress outside the gates of Fort Bragg. Her brother Isaiah had died in a place that did not officially exist, on a mission that was still classified, in a war that America pretended it had not fought in Laos. The army had sent his body home in a flag-draped coffin, had presented her mother with a folded flag and a medal and condolences that meant nothing. They had told the family that Isaiah died bravely, that he was a hero, that his sacrifice mattered. But they would not tell them how. They would not tell them where. And they would not tell them who had carried his body out of the jungle, when leaving it behind would have been so much easier. Her mother had known, somehow, had known that someone had kept a promise. She talked about it constantly in her final years, as the dementia slowly erased everything else. The man who brought my boy home. I want to thank the man who brought my boy home. She had died with those words on her lips, reaching for a hand that was not there, thanking a stranger she would never meet. Darlene had taken up the search after the funeral. She had written letters to the Army, to the VA, to every veterans organization she could find. She had attended VFW gatherings and American Legion meetings and Memorial Day ceremonies across half the country. Always looking, always asking, always hoping that someone would know the name she was seeking. The responses were always the same. The records are classified. The personnel files are sealed. We cannot help you. But tonight was the 53rd anniversary of her brother's death. And something had drawn her to this small town, to this particular VFW post, to a Memorial Day ceremony where her brother's name would be read aloud among the honored dead. She paused just inside the door, scanning the room with eyes that had learned to read people during 40 years as a hospice nurse. She saw the politicians with their practiced smiles. She saw the veterans with their caps and their memories. She saw the bar and the bunting and the banner proclaiming "We remember our fallen." And she saw the confrontation happening in the corner. A heavy-set man in a too-tight VFW jacket was standing over someone seated at a table partially hidden by a support column. His voice was loud enough to carry across the hall, theatrical in its contempt. The seated figure was barely visible, just a glimpse of worn flannel and gray hair and hands that remained perfectly still on the tablecloth. Darlene moved closer, drawn by an instinct she could not name. "I have had enough of this," the heavy-set man was saying. His name tag read Rex Turnbull, Post Commander. "You have got exactly 2 minutes left, and then I am calling the police. This is your final warning." The seated man's response was too quiet to hear from across the room, but something about his stillness caught Darlene's attention. It was not the stillness of defeat or submission. It was the stillness of a man who had learned to wait, who understood that patience was sometimes the most powerful weapon. She was close enough now to see him clearly. An old man, late 70s at least, wearing clothes that did not fit and boots held together with tape. His beard was long and unkempt. His face was weathered by years of exposure to elements that most people experienced only through windows. He looked like exactly what Rex Turnbull had accused him of being, a homeless man who had wandered in from the street. But his posture was perfect. His shoulders were square. His spine was straight. And when his eyes moved to the memorial wall on the east side of the hall, there was something in them that Darlene recognized. She had seen that look before, in the photographs her mother kept of Isaiah, in the faces of the dying veterans she had cared for in hospice. The look of a man who carried the dead with him everywhere he went. Rex noticed her approach and straightened, his demeanor shifting from aggressor to politician in an instant. "Ma'am, good evening." He extended his hand with a smile that did not reach his eyes. "Rex Turnbull, Post Commander. Welcome to our Memorial Day ceremony. Is there something I can help you with?" Darlene did not take his hand. She was looking past him at the old man in the corner, at the wall behind him where 3 names were engraved on a brass plaque. "What is happening here?" she asked. Rex's smile tightened. "Just a small misunderstanding. This gentleman wandered in, and I have been explaining that this is a private event for veterans and their families. Nothing to concern yourself with." Darlene looked at the old man. He had not moved, had not spoken, but his eyes had shifted to her face. And for just a moment, something flickered in them. Recognition? No, that was impossible. They had never met. Unless... She looked at the memorial wall again. Read the names. Sergeant First Class William Draper. Staff Sergeant Emmanuel Cross. And there, at the bottom, Corporal Isaiah Okonkwo. Her breath caught. Her heart stuttered. 53 years of searching, and her brother's name was on this wall. In this VFW. Feet away from a homeless man who insisted on staying for the reading of the names. "Excuse me," she said, her voice suddenly unsteady. She pushed past Rex and walked to the wall, her fingers trembling as they reached out to touch the brass letters that spelled her brother's name. The metal was cool beneath her fingertips. Real. Solid. Proof that he had existed, that he had mattered, that someone had remembered him. Behind her, she heard Rex's voice, irritated and confused. "Mom? Ma'am, the ceremony has not started yet. If you would like to take a seat." But Darlene was not listening. She was turning back toward the corner table, toward the old man who sat alone, toward the eyes that had watched her touch her brother's name with something that looked almost like grief. And in those eyes, for just a moment, she saw Isaiah looking back at her. The jungle had a sound that Elias had never been able to describe to anyone who had not heard it. Not the birds, or the insects, or the distant rumble of artillery. Something underneath all of that. A breathing. A pulse. The sound of a living thing that was waiting to swallow you whole. They had been 3 miles from the extraction point when the ambush hit. The first RPG took out Draper before anyone could shout a warning. One moment he was on point, moving through the undergrowth with the quiet competence of a man who had done this 100 times. The next moment he was gone, replaced by a crater of mud and shattered trees and silence. The sound came after, the way thunder follows lightning, a roar that seemed to come from everywhere at once. Cross died in the first volley of gunfire that followed. Elias saw him spin, saw the red mist that erupted from his chest, saw the way his body crumpled like a puppet with cut strings. There was no time to mourn, no time to think, only time to move, to return fire, to try to keep the rest of his team alive. They had been outnumbered at least 5-1. NVA regulars, not the poorly trained militia they had expected. Someone had known they were coming. Someone had set up the kill zone with professional precision. The trees around them exploded with gunfire, splinters flying like shrapnel, the air thick with the smell of cordite and blood and fresh-turned earth. Zeke was beside him, firing controlled bursts from his rifle, his young face set in concentration. 19 years old and steady as a rock. Elias remembered feeling a surge of pride in that moment, a flash of something that felt almost like hope. The kid was going to make it. The kid was going to be one of the great ones. And then Zeke turned to check their flank, and the bullet caught him in the throat. The memory was so vivid that Elias could still feel the weight of Zeke's body falling against him, could still feel the hot spray of blood across his face, could still hear the wet, gurgling sound as Zeke tried to speak, tried to say something, tried to deliver a message that his ruined throat could no longer form. Elias had pressed his hand against the wound, knowing it was futile, knowing that no amount of pressure could stop the river of red that pulsed between his fingers. Zeke's eyes were wide, confused, the eyes of a boy who had not yet accepted that he was dying. "Hold on," Elias had said. "Just hold on, Zeke. We're getting out of here." But even as he said it, he knew it was a lie. The femoral artery was severed. Maybe the carotid too. There was too much blood, spreading too fast, soaking into the jungle floor like rain into dry earth. 90 seconds. That was how long it took. 90 seconds for a 19-year-old boy from the south side of Chicago to bleed out in the arms of a man who had promised to bring him home. Zeke's lips moved one last time. No sound came out, but Elias could read the words. "Tell my mama I didn't cry." And then he was gone. And the gunfire was still raging. And Elias had a choice to make. Leave the body. Save yourself. Complete the mission. That was what training dictated. That was what common sense demanded. The extraction point was 3 miles away through enemy-held territory. Carrying a body would slow him down, make noise, increased the chances of detection 100-fold. Every tactical manual ever written would have told him to leave Corporal Isaiah Okonkwo in that jungle and run. But Elias had made a promise to a woman in a Sunday dress, a woman who had traveled across the country just to see her son one more time before he deployed, a woman whose grip on his arm had carried the weight of every mother who had ever sent a child to war. Bring him home. Whatever happens over there, you bring my boy home. So Elias lifted Zeke onto his shoulders, 170 pounds of dead weight, plus 60 pounds of gear. He felt his knees buckle, felt his spine compress, felt every muscle in his body scream in protest. And then he started walking. 14 hours. That was how long it took. 14 hours of moving through jungle that wanted to kill him, past enemy patrols that would have killed him if they had seen him, over terrain that seemed designed by a malevolent god to break the human body. He killed 17 NVA soldiers along the way, some with his rifle, some with his knife, one with his bare hands, in a silent struggle that lasted less than 30 seconds but felt like an eternity. When he finally reached the extraction point, the helicopter crew did not recognize him. He was covered in blood, most of it not his own. His uniform was shredded. His face was a mask of mud and exhaustion and something that might have been madness. But he was still carrying Zeke, still holding onto the body of a boy whose mother was waiting for him to come home. They tried to take Zeke from him. He would not let go. Not until they sedated him. Not until the drugs pulled him down into a darkness where he did not have to remember the weight on his shoulders or the words on dying lips. Tell my mama I didn't cry. The memory released him like a hand opening, and Elias was back in the VFW hall, back at the corner table, back in the present, where a woman with silver hair was staring at him with an expression he could not read. She had touched the name on the wall, Isaiah Okonkwo. She had touched it like it meant something to her, like it was personal, and now she was looking at him with eyes that were achingly familiar. Brown eyes with flecks of gold, eyes he had seen before, 53 years ago, in a face that smiled too easily and wrote letters he never mailed. Zeke's eyes. This woman had Zeke's eyes. Elias felt his heart stutter, felt his breath catch in his throat, felt the weight of 53 years of silence pressing down on his shoulders like a body he had never stopped carrying. She was still looking at him, still searching his face for something she could not name. And Elias knew, with a certainty that went beyond logic or reason, that the promise he had made to a woman in a Sunday dress was not finished yet. He had brought Zeke's body home, but he had never delivered the message. Tell my mama I didn't cry. Darlene could not look away from the old man in the corner. There was something about him that pulled at her, a gravity she could not explain. He was staring at her now with an intensity that should have been unsettling, but instead felt like recognition. Like he knew her. Like he had been waiting for her for a very long time. Mom. Rex Turnbull's voice cut through the moment like a dull knife. Ma'am, I need you to step away from there. The ceremony is about to begin, and we need to clear this area. Darlene turned to face him, and something in her expression made him take a half step back. That name on the wall, she said. Isaiah Okonkwo. That was my brother. Rex blinked. His mouth opened, then closed. The politician's mask flickered, uncertain how to process this information. Your brother? He died in 1971. Darlene's voice was steady, but her hands were trembling. In Laos, on a mission that the army still will not talk about. I have been searching for 53 years to find out what happened to him, to find a man who brought his body home. The silence that followed seemed to spread outward from the corner table like ripples in still water. Other veterans had stopped their conversations, turning to look. The bartender's hand paused mid-pour. Even the local politicians sensed that something had shifted, though they did not understand what. Rex recovered first, his voice dropping to what he probably thought was a sympathetic tone. Ma'am, I'm very sorry for your loss. But this man here, he gestured dismissively toward Elias. This man is not who you are looking for. He is just a homeless vagrant who wandered in off the street. He has no connection to your brother or anyone else on that wall. Darlene looked at Elias again. He had not moved, had not spoken. but his eyes were wet now, glistening in the fluorescent light of the VFW hall, and his hand had moved to his chest, pressing against something hidden beneath his worn flannel shirt. "How do you know?" she asked Rex without looking at him. "How do you know he has no connection?" "Because look at him." Rex's contempt was back, overriding whatever momentary sympathy he had mustered. "He is a mess. He cannot even take care of himself. You think a man like that could have served in special forces? Could have carried out some heroic mission in Laos?" He laughed, a harsh sound that echoed off the walls. "Ma'am, I have been in the military. I know what real soldiers look like, and that is not it." From across the room, a new voice spoke, quiet but carrying. "You might want to reconsider that assessment, Commander." Everyone turned. An elderly man in a wheelchair was rolling himself toward the corner table. He wore a green beret despite the indoor setting, and his chest was covered with ribbons and medals that clinked softly as he moved. His face was weathered, his hands gnarled with age, but his eyes were sharp and clear. "Colonel Mitchell Abernathy," he said, stopping his chair a few feet from the corner table. "Retired. Special Forces. Served in Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia from 1968 to 1975. Rex straightened, suddenly uncertain. "Colonel, I did not realize you were here tonight. I was just explaining to this woman that—" "I heard what you were explaining." The colonel's voice was cold. "I have been watching this situation develop for the last 20 minutes, and I've been trying to figure out why this man looks so familiar." He wheeled himself closer to Elias, peering at him with the intensity of a man trying to read fine print without his glasses. Elias met his gaze, but did not speak, did not move, barely seemed to breathe. The colonel's eyes dropped to Elias's forearm, where the sleeve of his flannel shirt had ridden up slightly. Darlene followed his gaze and saw what he was looking at. Faded ink on weathered skin, numbers, coordinates, and something else, something she could not quite make out from where she stood. The colonel's face went pale. "Roll up your sleeve," he said. His voice had changed. It was no longer cold. It was something else entirely, something that sounded almost like fear. Elias did not move for a long moment. Then, slowly, deliberately, he reached down and began to roll up his left sleeve. The fabric was stiff with age and grime, resistant, but it gave way inch by inch, revealing more of the tattoo beneath. Coordinates. A date. March 15th, 1971. And below that, a symbol that made Colonel Abernathy's breath catch audibly in his throat. An arrowhead with a dagger through it, crossed by 3 lightning bolts. The insignia of a unit that officially did not exist. But that was not what made the colonel's hands begin to shake. Below the insignia, in faded black ink, were 3 sets of initials. VFW Io William Draper. Emmanuel Cross. Isaiah Okonkwo. And below those, 2 words that the colonel whispered aloud like a prayer. Schiperdactual. The room went absolutely silent. Darlene did not understand what she was seeing, did not recognize the insignia or the call sign. But she understood the coordinates. She understood the date. March 15th, 1971. The day her brother died. She looked at the old man in the corner, at his weathered face and his wet eyes and his perfect posture, at the hand still pressed against his chest, against whatever he carried there, at the tattoo that bore her brother's initials, etched permanently into skin that had carried him home. "You," she breathed. The word came out broken, barely a whisper. "You are the one. You brought him back." Elias finally moved. His hand dropped from his chest to the chain around his neck, pulling it free from beneath his shirt. 2 sets of dog tags dangled in the light, and between them, catching the fluorescent glow like a fallen star, was a woman's wedding ring. "I promised your mother," he said. His voice was hoarse, cracked, the voice of a man who had not spoken this truth aloud in 53 years. "I promised her I would bring him home, and I kept my word." Darlene's knees buckled. She caught herself on the edge of the corner table, her fingers gripping the worn wood so hard that her knuckles went white. 53 years. 53 years of searching, of asking, of praying to a God she sometimes doubted for just one answer. And here he was, sitting in a VFW hall in clothes that did not fit, being ordered to leave by a man who had never heard a shot fired in anger. "My mother," she said, and her voice broke on the word. "My mother died looking for you. She spent her last years asking for you, calling out for the man who brought her boy home. She never knew your name. She never got to thank you." Elias closed his eyes. The weight of that truth settled onto his shoulders like a physical thing, pressing him down into the chair. He had known, of course, had known that Zeke's mother would want to find him, had known that his silence was a kind of cruelty, even if it was not intended as one. But the mission had been classified. The operation had been erased from official records. And by the time the files were finally unsealed decades later, he had convinced himself that too much time had passed, that showing up on a doorstep with 50-year-old grief would only reopen wounds that might have healed. He had been wrong. He understood that now. Some wounds never healed. Some questions echoed forever in the silence where answers should have been. "I am sorry," he said. The words felt impossibly small. "I wanted to find her, to tell her." But they classified everything. My name, my unit, the whole operation. I was not allowed to contact anyone connected to the men who died. Colonel Abernathy nodded slowly, his face grim. "He is telling the truth. I remember when those files were sealed. Congressional order. Anything connected to operations in Laos was buried so deep that even the men who served there could not talk about it. Careers were ended over less." Rex Turnbull had gone very still. His face had lost its color, replaced by a grayish pallor that made him look suddenly old. He opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. No words came out. Darlene straightened, wiping her eyes with the back of her hand. She looked at Elias with an intensity that seemed to cut through every barrier he had built over the decades. "Tell me," she said. "Tell me what happened to my brother. Tell me how he died." The request hung in the air. Around them, the VFW hall had gone completely silent. The politicians had stopped working the room. The bartender had abandoned his post. Even the news cameras, originally positioned for the memorial ceremony, had swung toward the corner table where history was unfolding in real time. Elias looked at the woman with his dead friend's eyes and knew that he owed her the truth. All of it. The parts that still woke him at 3 in the morning. The parts he had never spoken aloud to anyone except Eleanor. The parts that had broken something inside him that had never fully healed. "We inserted at 0300, he began. His voice was quiet, but it carried through the silent hall. "March 15th, 1971. 6-man team. Extraction mission. CIA had an asset that needed to come home." He told her about the jungle, about the breathing darkness, about Draper on point and Cross watching their 6 and Zeke beside him, steady as a rock despite being the youngest man on the team. He told her about the ambush, about the RPG that erased Draper from existence, about Cross spinning and falling with a red mist where his chest had been, about the chaos and the gunfire and the impossible mathematics of 6 against 30. And then he told her about Zeke. The bullet caught him in the throat. Elias's voice cracked, just slightly on the word. He turned to check our flank, and it caught him right here. He touched his own neck, fingers tracing the path of a wound he had memorized 53 years ago. Severed the artery. Maybe 2 of them. There was nothing I could do. Nothing anyone could have done. Darlene was crying silently, tears streaming down her face, but she did not look away. Did not ask him to stop. I held him, Elias continued. Held him while he bled out. 90 seconds. That is how long it took. 90 seconds for the bravest kid I ever served with to die in my arms. He paused, and when he spoke again, his voice was barely a whisper. His last words were about your mother. He said, "Tell my mama I didn't cry." The sound that came for Darlene was not a sob. It was something deeper, something more primal. The sound of a wound that had been open for 53 years finally being acknowledged. Colonel Abernathy bowed his head. Several veterans in the crowd did the same. A woman near the bar pressed her hand to her mouth, her own tears falling freely. And Rex Turnbull stood frozen, his face a mask of dawning horror as he began to understand exactly what he had done. Exactly who he had tried to throw out of this hall on Memorial Day. Exactly how wrong he had been about everything. But Elias was not finished. His eyes found Rex's, and in them was something that was not anger. something that was almost pity. "You asked me to prove I served," he said quietly. "You want to know what gives me the right to sit at this table? To stay for the reading of the names." He reached into the pocket of his worn flannel shirt and pulled out a small leather case, cracked with age, held together by a rubber band that had lost most of its elasticity. "This is what gives me the right," he said, and he opened the case. Inside, resting on faded velvet, was a medal, a 5-point star made of gold, hanging from a light blue ribbon decorated with 13 white stars. The Medal of Honor, the highest award the nation could bestow. The room did not gasp. It did something worse. It went so silent that Darlene could hear her own heartbeat pounding in her ears. And Rex Turnbull's knees began to buckle. The Medal of Honor caught the fluorescent light and held it, gleaming with a quiet dignity that seemed to fill the entire room. Elias did not look at it. He had not looked at it in years, had kept it hidden in the bottom of his rucksack like a secret he was ashamed of, not because he was not proud of what it represented, but because the weight of it had always felt like too much to bear. "They gave me this because I would not leave him behind," he said, his voice steady despite the tears that tracked silently down his weathered cheeks. "Because I carried Zeke for 6 miles through enemy territory. Because I killed 17 men who tried to stop me. Because when I finally reached the extraction point, I was still holding on to him." He looked at Darlene, and his voice softened. "But I did not do it for a medal. I did it because I made a promise. And because your brother deserved to come home." Colonel Abernathy wheeled himself forward until he was beside the corner table. His gnarled hands gripped the arms of his wheelchair so tightly that the tendons stood out like cables beneath his papery skin. "I know this story," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "Every Special Forces officer who served after 1975 knows this story. They teach it at the JFK Special Warfare Center. They use it as an example of what it means to never leave a man behind." He turned to face the crowd that had gathered around the corner table, his eyes sweeping across veterans and civilians alike. "This man," he said, pointing at Elias, "is a legend. His call sign was Shepherd because he always brought his men home. Every single one. Dead or alive, he brought them home. Do you understand what that means? Do you understand what kind of man it takes to carry a body through 6 miles of jungle with an entire NVA battalion hunting him?" The silence in the hall was absolute. Even the hum of the air conditioning seemed to have stopped, as if the building itself was holding its breath. Rex Turnbull had not moved. His knees had buckled, but he had caught himself on a nearby chair, his fingers white-knuckled on its back. His face was the color of old concrete, gray and crumbling, and his eyes were fixed on the medal in Elias's hand with the horror of a man watching his entire world collapse. "I did not know," he whispered. The words were barely audible. "I did not know." Elias looked at him. There was no anger in his eyes, no satisfaction at the post commander's humiliation, only a weariness that went deeper than bone, deeper than muscle, all the way down to the place where the soul lived. "No," he said quietly. "You did not." He closed the leather case and slipped it back into his pocket. The medal disappeared, but its presence lingered in the room like the echo of a bell. "I did not come here for recognition," Elias continued. "I never wanted anyone to know. I just wanted to sit at this table on Memorial Day and remember the men who died, to hear their names read aloud, to honor them the only way I know how." He touched the dog tags around his neck, his fingers tracing the familiar contours of metal that had hung against his chest for more than half a century. "I have been coming to this table for 20 years, he said, "since before my wife died. She used to come with me. We would sit here together, and she would hold my hand while they read the names. And when they got to Draper and Cross and Okonkwo, she would squeeze my fingers and whisper that they were proud of me, that I had done enough, that I could let go." His voice broke on the last word, cracking open to reveal the grief beneath. "But I cannot let go. Not of them. Not of her. When Eleanor died, I lost the only person who made the weight bearable. And I do not know how to carry it alone anymore." Darlene stepped closer to the table. Her tears had stopped, replaced by something else, something that looked like determination. "So you left," she said softly. "You walked away from everything." Elias nodded. "I gave away the house, the furniture, everything that reminded me of her. I kept only what I could carry. Her ring, Her book. The letters your brother wrote to your mother. Darlene's breath caught. The letters? He never mailed them. Elias's hand moved to his chest, pressing against the place where his heart beat beneath layers of worn fabric. He wrote one every night, folded them up, kept them in his pocket. He was going to give them all to her when he got home. A whole stack of letters, proof that he thought of her every single day. The sound that escaped Darlene was half sob, half laugh. A broken noise that contained 53 years of longing. You have them? Her voice trembled. You still have Isaiah's letters? Elias reached into his rucksack, the battered green bag that held everything he owned. His hands moved with the careful precision of a man handling something sacred, something irreplaceable. And he pulled out a small bundle wrapped in plastic, protected against weather and time and all the years that had passed since a 19-year-old boy from Chicago wrote love letters to a mother he would never see again. I kept them safe, Elias said, holding the bundle out toward Darlene. I always meant to deliver them. I just never knew how to find you. Never knew how to explain. Darlene took the letters with shaking hands. The plastic crinkled as she unwrapped it, revealing yellowed paper, creased and worn, covered in handwriting she had not seen since she was 15 years old. Her brother's handwriting. Oh God, she breathed. Oh God, Isaiah. She pressed the letters to her chest and wept. And around her, in a VFW hall on Memorial Day, hardened veterans wiped their eyes and remembered their own brothers, their own losses, their own letters that never got delivered. And Rex Turnbull slid slowly down the chair he had been gripping, his legs finally giving out, until he was kneeling on the floor of the hall he commanded, humbled beyond words by a homeless man he had tried to throw away. The news cameras had captured everything. The confrontation, the revelation, the Medal of Honor gleaming in the fluorescent light, the bundle of letters passing from weathered hands to trembling ones, the post commander on his knees, broken by the weight of his own arrogance. By morning, it would be national news. By the following week, it would be international. But in this moment, none of that mattered. In this moment, there was only a corner table in a VFW hall and the people gathered around it, and the truth that had finally been spoken after 53 years of silence. Darlene could not stop touching the letters. Her fingers traced the edges of the yellowed paper, feeling the places where her brother's pen had pressed hard, where his words had been urgent, where his love had poured out onto the page in handwriting she had almost forgotten. She had not opened them yet. That would come later, in private, where she could read them without an audience. But just holding them was enough. Just knowing they existed was enough. He wrote to her every night, she said, her voice wondering. All those years, I thought he had forgotten us. Thought maybe the war had changed him, made him hard. But he was writing to her every single night. Elias nodded. He never forgot. Not for 1 second. He talked about you too, you know. His baby sister who was smarter than everyone else in the family. Who was going to be a doctor someday. Darlene laughed, a wet sound that caught her throat. I became a nurse instead. Hospice care. I spent my career helping people die with dignity. She looked at Elias, and something shifted in her eyes. Maybe that is why, she said softly. Maybe I was always looking for him at the end. Every patient I sat with, every hand I held in those final moments. Maybe I was practicing for this. The words hung in the air between them, heavy with meaning that neither of them fully understood. Colonel Abernathy cleared his throat. The sound was gentle, almost apologetic, but it drew attention nonetheless. Staff Sergeant Henshaw, he said formally, I think it is time we heard the rest of the story. The part they left out of the citation. The part that explains how a man who earned the Medal of Honor ended up living on the streets. Elias was quiet for a long moment. His hand moved to Eleanor's ring, hanging on the chain beside the dog tags, and he turned it slowly between his fingers. I served for 31 years, he said finally. Retired as a command sergeant major. Had a good life. A wife who loved me. A home. A purpose. He paused, and when he continued, his voice was rougher. But I never stopped carrying them. Draper. Cross. Okonkwo. Every night, I dreamed about that jungle. Every morning, I woke up with the weight of Zeke's body on my shoulders. I learned to live with it. Eleanor helped me live with it. She was the only one who could reach me when the darkness got too thick. He looked at the ring in his fingers, and his eyes grew distant. She got sick 7 years ago. Cancer. The bad kind. The kind that eats through you like fire through paper. I watched her fade for 18 months. Watched the strongest woman I ever knew become a shadow of herself. And when she finally let go, when she finally stopped fighting, she made me promise to keep living. His voice cracked, but I did not know how. Without her, I did not know how to carry the weight anymore. So I stopped trying. He gestured at his worn clothes, his unkempt beard, the rucksack that held everything he owned. I gave it all away. The house, the pension, the benefits. I did not deserve them. I could not save her. All those men I brought home from the jungle, and I could not save my own wife from a disease I could not fight. The silence that followed was absolute. Even Rex, still kneeling on the floor, seemed frozen in place. Darlene set the letters carefully on the table and reached out to take Elias's hand. The gesture was simple, human, the kind of touch that required no explanation. "You could not have saved her," she said gently. "No one could. Cancer does not care about courage or promises or how many miles you are willing to carry someone." "I know that," Elias said. "I know it here." He touched his temple. "But here," he moved his hand to his heart, "here I still feel like I failed her. Like I broke my promise." "You promised to keep living," Darlene said. "And you have. You're still here." Elias looked at her, and for the first time since the confrontation began, something that might have been hope flickered in his eyes. "I am still here," he repeated as if testing the words. "Still here." The moment stretched between them, fragile and precious. And then Colonel Abernathy spoke again, his voice carrying across the silent hall. "I think," he said slowly, "that it is time for the reading of the names." He looked at Rex, still kneeling on the floor, and his expression was not unkind. "Post Commander, I believe that is your responsibility." Rex looked up. His face was streaked with tears. He did not seem to know he was crying. His hands were shaking. His voice, when it finally came, was barely a whisper. "I cannot," he said. "Not after what I did. I do not have the right." "Then find someone who does," Abernathy said, "because those names deserve to be read. And this man," he gestured at Elias, "deserves to hear them." Rex looked at Elias. For a long moment, the two men held each other's gaze. The post commander who had tried to throw him out, and the Medal of Honor recipient who had not fought back. The man who judged by appearances, and the man who had learned that appearances meant nothing in the places that mattered. And then Rex did something that no one expected. He turned to Elias, still on his knees, and bowed his head. "Would you read them?" His voice was broken, humbled beyond recognition. "The names. Would you read the names of the fallen?" The request hung in the air like a prayer. Elias looked at Rex for a long moment. The post commander was still on his knees, his head bowed, his shoulders shaking with silent sobs. 20 minutes ago, this man had called him a vagrant, had accused him of stolen valor, had threatened to have him arrested for trespassing, and now he was asking Elias to perform the most sacred duty of the Memorial Day ceremony. The room waited, 100 people holding their breath, watching to see what the homeless man with the Medal of Honor would do. Elias rose slowly from the corner table. His joints protested, stiff from years of sleeping on concrete and park benches and the hard ground beneath highway overpasses. But his posture was perfect. His spine was straight. And when he stood at his full height, something shifted in the air around him. The soldier emerged. It was subtle, the transformation, a squaring of the shoulders, a lifting of the chin, a steadiness in the eyes that had been hidden beneath years of grief and self-imposed exile. The homeless man was still there, in the worn clothes and the unkempt beard and the boots held together with tape. But underneath all of that, visible now for everyone to see, was Command Sergeant Major Elias Henshaw, call sign Shepherd, the man who always brought his people home. "I will read the names," he said. His voice was quiet, but it carried. Colonel Abernathy nodded, his eyes bright with unshed tears. "Then let us begin." The crowd parted as Elias walked toward the podium at the front of the hall. The news cameras tracked his movement, capturing every step of the journey from the corner table to the stage. Veterans in the crowd straightened as he passed, some saluting, others simply bowing their heads in respect. Rex remained on his knees near the corner table. No one helped him up. No one spoke to him. He had become invisible, erased by the magnitude of what he had done and what he had witnessed. Elias climbed the 3 steps to the stage and stood behind the podium. Before him, a laminated sheet listed the names of every local veteran who had died in service to their country. 47 names, spanning from World War II to Afghanistan. Each one representing a life cut short, a family forever changed, a hole in the fabric of a community that would never fully heal. He looked out the crowd, at the veterans with their caps and their medals and their memories, at the families who had come to honor fathers and mothers and siblings and children, at Darlene, still standing by the corner table, her brother's letters pressed against her heart. And he began. Sergeant Thomas Aldrich, he read. United States Army. Cordell, 1951. The response came from the crowd, a single word spoken in unison. Present. Corporal Benjamin Barnwell. United States Marine Corps. Vietnam, 1968. Present. The names flowed from his lips like a river. Each one spoken with care, with reverence, with the understanding that these were not just names. They were people. They were stories. They were sacrifices that could never be repaid. Staff Sergeant Emmanuel Cross. United States Army Special Forces. Laos, 1971. Present. The word caught in Elias's throat, but he pushed through. His hands gripped the edges of the podium, knuckles white. Sergeant First Class William Draper. United States Army Special Forces. Laos, 1971. Present. And then he reached the name he had been carrying for 53 years. The name that had been tattooed on his arm, engraved on his heart, whispered in his nightmares and his prayers. Corporal Isaiah Okonkwo. He paused, his voice trembling. United States Army Special Forces. Laos, 1971. From the back of the hall, near the corner table, Darlene's voice rose clear and strong. Present. The word echoed through the silent hall. Present. As if Isaiah himself had answered. As if all the years of searching and grieving and hoping had finally found their resolution in that single syllable. Elias closed his eyes. A tear slipped down his weathered cheek and fell onto the podium. He finished the list. 47 names, spoken aloud, honored and remembered. And when the last name had been read, when the final present had faded into silence, he looked up at the crowd one more time. These names are not just letters on a wall, he said. His voice was stronger now, carrying the authority of a man who had seen too much and survived too much to be silenced. They were sons and daughters, husbands and wives, brothers and sisters. They were people who believed in something larger than themselves, and they gave everything for that belief. He looked at Rex, still kneeling near the corner table. It is easy to judge a man by his appearance, by the clothes he wears or the life he lives. It is easy to assume that a homeless man has nothing to offer, nothing to teach, nothing worth hearing. He paused, letting the words sink in. But every veteran you see on these streets, every man or woman who looks broken, remember that they might have carried a weight you will never understand. They might have seen things you cannot imagine. They might have sacrificed parts of themselves that will never grow back. His eyes swept across the crowd. Do not judge. Do not assume. Just remember. That is all I ask. Remember the names. Remember the faces. Remember that every life has a story, and some of those stories are worth more than you could ever know. The silence that followed was not empty. It was full of grief and gratitude and the kind of respect that cannot be demanded, only earned. And then, from somewhere in the crowd, a single pair of hands began to clap. Others joined, one by one, then in groups, until the entire hall was filled with applause. Veterans rose to their feet. Civilians followed. Even the politicians, sensing the moment, stood and clapped with what might have been genuine emotion. Elias stood at the podium, tears streaming down his face, and let the sound wash over him like rain after a long drought. The applause continued for a long time. Waves of it, rolling through the hall like thunder that would not stop. Veterans who had served in different wars, different decades, different branches, united in their recognition of something rare and precious. A man who had earned the highest honor the nation could bestow, and who had asked for nothing in return but the right to remember his fallen brothers. Elias stood at the podium, overwhelmed. He had spent 7 years invisible, a ghost drifting through a world that looked past him as if he did not exist. Shopkeepers who avoided eye contact, pedestrians who crossed the street to avoid walking near him, police officers who moved him along from doorways and park benches with barely concealed contempt. He had grown accustomed to being unseen, had even come to prefer it. Invisibility was a kind of armor, protecting him from questions he did not want to answer and memories he could not escape. But now he was seen. Now he was known, and the weight of that recognition was almost more than he could bear. Colonel Abernathy wheeled himself to the base of the stage, looking up at Elias with eyes that understood. "Come down from there, Shepherd," he said gently. "You have done enough for one night." Elias nodded, suddenly exhausted. He descended the steps slowly, his legs unsteady, and found himself immediately surrounded by veterans who wanted to shake his hand, to thank him, to share their own stories of loss and survival. He accepted their handshakes with the automatic courtesy of a career soldier, but his eyes kept drifting back to the corner table, to Darlene, who still stood there with her brother's letters clutched against her chest, to Rex, who had finally risen from his knees but stood apart from the crowd, isolated by his shame. The news crews were packing up their equipment, already composing the stories they would tell. Medal of Honor recipient found homeless, confronted by VFW commander. The headlines would write themselves. By morning, Rex Turnbull's face would be on every screen in America, a symbol of everything wrong with how the country treated its veterans. Elias felt no satisfaction at the thought. He had not wanted this, had not wanted any of it. He had only wanted to sit at the corner table and hear the names read aloud, as he did every Memorial Day, as he had done since before Eleanor died. A hand touched his arm. Gentille tentative. He turned to find Darlene beside him, her eyes red from crying, but her face calm. "I need to show you something," she said. She led him through the crowd, past the veterans who parted respectfully, past the politicians who nodded with practiced solemnity, until they reached the corner table. The table that had been empty for 53 years. The table where Shepard's team had once gathered between missions, laughing and drinking and planning futures that would never arrive. Darlene reached in her purse and pulled out a photograph. It was old, the colors faded, the edges worn soft from handling. She held it out to Elias, and his breath caught in his throat. The photograph showed a woman in a Sunday dress, standing outside the gates of Fort Bragg. Beside her, in his dress uniform, was a young soldier with a bright smile and eyes that sparkled with life. Isaiah Okonkwo, Zeke, 19 years old and invincible, posing with the mother who had traveled across the country just to see him one more time. "My mother kept this photograph on her nightstand until the day she died," Darlene said. "She would talk to it every night, tell Isaiah about her day, ask him to watch over me, and she would always end with the same words." Darlene's voice trembled. "Thank you," she would say. "Thank you to the man who brought my boy home." Elias stared at the photograph, at the woman who had gripped his arm outside those gates and made him promise, at the boy who had written letters every night and never got to deliver them, at the life that had been cut short in a jungle that officially did not exist. She knew, Darlene continued. Somehow, she knew that someone had carried him out, that someone had refused to leave him behind, and she spent her whole life grateful to a man she never met. Elias could not speak. The tears came freely now, streaming down his face and into his beard, falling onto the photograph like rain on a grave. "I am sorry," he finally managed. "I'm sorry I never found her. I'm sorry I never told her." Darlene took his hand. Her grip was warm, steady, anchoring him to a present he had been running from for 7 years. "You are telling me now," she said, "and I'm going to tell you what she would have said if she could be here." She squeezed his hand hard. "Thank you. Thank you for keeping your promise. Thank you for bringing my brother home. Thank you for carrying him when no one would have blamed you for leaving him behind. She pulled him into an embrace, wrapping her arms around the man who had carried her brother's body through 6 miles of jungle, who had kept his letters safe for 53 years, who had sacrificed everything he had for a promise made to a woman in a Sunday dress. And Elias Henshaw, Command Sergeant Major, Medal of Honor recipient, call sign Shepherd, wept like a child in the arms of his dead friend's sister. The corner table stood beside them, no longer empty. For the first time in 53 years, it was surrounded by people who understood why it mattered. And somewhere, somehow, the men whose names were carved on the wall seemed to lean in closer, listening to the sounds of reunion and healing that filled the air around the place where they had once gathered. The crowd began to thin as the evening wore on. Politicians slipped away first, their handlers already calculating how to position themselves in relation to the story that would dominate the news cycle. Then the casual attendees, the ones who had come for the ceremony but had no personal stake in the names on the wall. Finally, only the veterans remained, the ones who understood, the ones who had their own names they carried, their own weights they bore, their own corners of memory they visited on nights like this. Elias and Darlene sat at the corner table. The letters were spread between them now, carefully unfolded, their yellowed pages covered with Isaiah's handwriting. Darlene read them aloud, one by one, her voice steady despite the tears that never quite stopped falling. Dear Mama, the first one began. Made it through another day. Sergeant Henshaw says, I am doing good. He is hard but fair like Daddy was. I think you would like him. The words painted a picture of a young man far from home, finding his footing in a world of danger and brotherhood. Isaiah wrote about the food, which was terrible, about the heat, which was worse, about the other men on his team, who had become his second family. Draper taught me how to play poker, one letter said. I'm getting pretty good. Do not tell Pastor Williams. Cross gave me a book about astronomy, said another. Says if I learn the stars, I will never be lost. I have been reading it every night. Did you know there are more stars than grains of sand on every beach in the world? Elias listened in silence. Some of these moments he remembered. The poker games, the astronomy book, the way Zeke's face had lit up when Cross showed him how to find the North Star. But most of them were new, glimpses of a young man's inner life that he had never been privileged to see. He writes about you a lot, Darlene said, looking up from a letter. She read aloud. Sergeant Henshaw is the best leader I have ever known. He makes us feel like we can do anything, like we are invincible. I want to be like him someday, Mama. I want to be the kind of man that other men trust with their lives. Elias closed his eyes. The weight of those words pressed down on him, heavier than Zeke's body had been on that long march through the jungle. He trusted me, he said quietly, and I got him killed. No, Darlene's voice was firm. You got him home. She reached across the table and took his hand. There is a difference, she said, between failing someone and being unable to save them. You did not fail my brother. You loved him. You led him. And when he fell, you carried him. She squeezed his fingers. That is not failure. That is devotion. The word hung in the air between them, filling the space with something that felt almost like peace. A throat cleared nearby. They looked up to find Colonel Abernathy beside the table, his wheelchair positioned with military precision. I have made some calls, he said. The VA, the local veteran services, a few contacts from my days in uniform. There are resources available, Sergeant Major. Housing programs, medical care, support groups for veterans dealing with complicated grief. He held up a hand before Elias could protest. I am not trying to save you, he said. You have proven quite thoroughly that you do not need saving. But I'm offering options, doors that are open if you choose to walk through them. Elias looked at Darlene, then back at the colonel. I do not know, he said slowly. I have been alone for a long time. I'm not sure I remember how to be anything else. Then let me make it simpler, Darlene said. She pulled a card from her purse and pressed it into his hand. I work at a hospice center. We have a veterans outreach program. And we have a spare room that has been empty for too long. She held his gaze, her brother's eyes looking out from her face. My mother prepared that room for herself, she said. She wanted to spend her final days near me. But the dementia took her before she could move in, and she died in a facility that did not know her name. Her voice caught, then steadied. That room has been waiting for the right person for 5 years. I think maybe it has been waiting for you. Elias stared at the card in his hand. A simple thing, a rectangle of paper with a name and phone number and address. A door, an option, a way forward that he had never imagined. I cannot, he started to say, but Darlene cut him off. You can, she said. The question is whether you will. She leaned closer, her voice dropping to something almost like a whisper. You kept my brother's letters safe for 53 years. You carried him through the jungle when leaving him would have been easier. You honored a promise to a woman you met once, outside the gates of a military base, on a day that changed both your lives. She pressed her hand over his heart. Let someone carry you now, she said. Let someone keep you safe. It is not weakness to accept help, Sergeant Major. It is trust. And I am asking you to trust me the way my brother trusted you. The VFW hall was nearly empty now. The banners hung limp. The flag stood silent. The memorial wall gleamed in the low light, names etched in brass, lives reduced to letters but never forgotten. Elias looked at the card in his hand, at the woman across from him, who had her brother's eyes and her mother's grip in a spare room that had been waiting for 5 years. He did not say yes. Not yet. But for the first time since Eleanor died, he did not say no. And in the language of men who have learned that hope is dangerous, that was as close to surrender as he could manage. 6 months later, the corner table was full. Elias sat in his usual spot, but he was not alone. Darlene was beside him, along with Colonel Abernathy and 3 other veterans who had found their way to the table over the past months. They met every Thursday evening, a small group that had grown from 2 to 6, bound together by stories they could not tell anyone else and wounds that would never fully heal. The VFW hall looked different now, brighter somehow. The memorial wall had been expanded, the brass plaques polished until they gleamed. A new photograph hung beside it, framed in oak and mounted with care. It showed a young soldier in his dress uniform, standing beside his mother outside the gates of Fort Bragg. Isaiah Okonkwo, finally home in every way that mattered. Elias looked different too. His beard was trimmed now, his hair cut short. He wore clothes that fit, donated by veterans organizations that had reached out after the story went national. The boots held together with duct tape had been replaced by sturdy leather ones, broken in but solid. He still carried his rucksack everywhere, the green canvas bag that held everything that mattered. But it was lighter now. So the weight had been set down. The spare room in Darlene's house had become his room. Not immediately. It had taken 3 weeks before he could bring himself to walk through the door, and another month before he stopped sleeping on the floor instead of the bed. Old habits died hard. But Darlene was patient the way hospice nurses learn to be patient. She did not push. She simply left the door open and let him decide when to walk through it. The letters had been donated to the National Museum of African American History and Culture, where they would be preserved and displayed as part of an exhibit on black soldiers in Vietnam. Isaiah Okonkwo's story would finally be told, not as a footnote in a classified operation, but as a testament to courage and love and the bonds that transcended death. Elias visited Eleanor's grave every Sunday. He brought her astronomy book, the one he had carried for 7 years, and read to her about the stars she had loved. Sometimes Darlene came with him. She would stand quietly while he talked to his wife, telling her about the week, about the progress he was making, about the darkness that still crept in sometimes but no longer swallowed him whole. I'm doing better, Elle, he would say. Not perfect, but better. I think you would be proud. The grief support group at the VA met on Tuesday afternoons. Elias had resisted at first, the way he resisted everything that felt like accepting help. But Colonel Abernathy had insisted, and Darlene had driven him to the first meeting, and somehow he had found himself talking about things he had never said aloud. About Zeke. About Eleanor. About the weight he had carried for so long that he had forgotten what it felt like to stand straight. The other veterans listened without judgment. They had their own weights, their own names, their own corners of memory they visited in the dark. And in the sharing of those burdens, something shifted. Not healed, never fully healed, but lightened, somehow, made bearable by the knowledge that he was not alone. Rex Turnbull had resigned as post commander 3 days after the Memorial Day incident. The video had gone viral, viewed millions of times, shared with comments that ranged from outrage to heartbroken. His face had become a symbol of everything wrong with how America treated its veterans, and no amount of apologies could undo the damage. But Elias had not wanted that, had not wanted Rex destroyed, only educated. So he had reached out, quietly, through channels that the media never learned about. A letter, handwritten, offering not forgiveness but understanding, explaining that judgment was easy, that appearances were deceiving, that the only path forward was through compassion rather than contempt. Rex had written back, a longer letter, filled with shame and gratitude and a promise to do better. He had started volunteering at a homeless shelter, working with veterans who looked the way Elias had looked on that Memorial Day evening, learning their names, hearing their stories, understanding, finally, that every life had weight, and some weights were too heavy to carry alone. This Memorial Day, the corner table was surrounded. Veterans from across the region had come to hear the names read aloud, to honor the fallen, to sit in the presence of a man whose story had reminded them why they served. The hall was packed, standing room only, and the ceremony had been covered by national news networks that wanted to show the follow-up, the redemption, the healing that had grown from that single confrontation. Elias stood at the podium again, the laminated list of names in his hands. But this year he was not alone. Darlene stood beside him, ready to answer when her brother's name was called. Colonel Abernathy sat in the front row, his beret crisp on his head, and scattered throughout the crowd were faces he recognized, veterans he had met over the past 6 months, men and women who had found their way to the corner table and discovered that they were not as alone as they had believed. He began to read. 47 names, spoken with reverence, answered with the word that meant everything. Present, present, present. And when he reached the name Isa Okonkwo, Darlene's voice rang out clear and strong, joined by a chorus of others who had learned the story, who understood what that name represented, who wanted to honor a young man from Chicago who had written letters every night and never got to deliver them. Present. Elias smiled through his tears. He looked at the corner table, at the photograph of Isaiah on the wall, at the faces of the veterans who had gathered to remember and to heal. Still here, brother, he whispered. Still here. If this story moved you, if it reminded you that second chances are possible, that heroes walk among us in the most unexpected forms, please subscribe to our channel. And share in the comments, who is the quiet hero in your life that deserves recognition? Sometimes the greatest warriors are not the ones still in uniform. They are the ones who learned to keep living when everything they loved was gone. Thank you for watching.